Good. Today's webinar will focus on formulating research questions. It will be a threefold webinar. The first part will focus on looking at research questions in general. The second part will look at techniques that can be used on crafting research questions. And in the third and final part, we will look at some examples of research questions. So those three parts are to be expected. And for the very first thing, perhaps it's worth it to note that actually the research questions are amongst the last thing to be written up in your thesis. This is to say that only at the very end, you will have a clear understanding of what the questions are. And what is the question is actually a very good question, because if the question has gone wrong, then everything else will fall apart. Now, having said that, the point here is that research questions do not pop out of the blue. It's a very structured process, and it's also a very known process on how questions do evolve over time. So at the beginning, you will start by looking at the purpose of the research. So what do you want to explore? This is the very first question you should ask yourself. What is unclear? What is unknown? And where is the starting point and situation? And for this, there are a number of questions that can be selected. And one of the very basic and first questions that is often asked is the question that starts with why. Why questions are looking for reasons, causes, and purposes, and they are very much common to qualitative research. They might also be very common to quantitative research at the initial stage or once it comes to the data interpretation. Next to why questions, there are a set of other questions that could be asked and that will be asked. And it's not that you need to settle on one of those types of question framing, but they will be used interchangeably as the research progresses. And the research progresses usually from an initial set of questions that is geared towards understanding the situation and how things belong together. And once this belonging together is getting more clear and the data is becoming available, then the question changes towards what is the data telling me, what can be observed. And once the data is saturating, it will become clear what are the final answers that the questions do answer. And this is a front and back way. So it's not that you start on the one end or just start over the answer. It's question and answer matching is an ongoing process that can be expected over the entire course of the research undertaking. Is that making sense to this point?
Yes, thank you.
Yes, it is.
Yes, it is. Right. So it's a constant matching process in between what is the data showing us and what does it explain. Now, if I talk about data first, this means that, of course, data will not be looked at in isolation to the literature, but it's a very different thing on trying to answer questions based upon the literature or trying to answer questions based upon the data that you have been collecting. And ideally, both things should come together gradually, means you will try to craft the questions based upon the information you hold from the literature as much as based upon the data that you have been collecting. So this is a sort of conversion that goes in parallel, hand in hand. And one of the tricky things here is obviously that there's just so much literature out there and that it could be an endless process of just trying to consult the literature and answering questions from there. So this is a dangerous thing because it might eat up your time. So it's important for you to draw boundaries around your questions. So what is clear already and what is not unclear, and to gradually try to work out those boundaries and to tighten them so to understand what are the questions and what are the answers. and what is within the core of my research and what is at the outer periphery that might be notable but will not be the core of my research. Is this boundary setting making sense to everyone?
Yes.
Yes.
It is.
Yes, it does. Yes.
Yes, it is.
Very well. So questions evolve over time. They start usually at the very beginning vague. That means that you will have many filling words rather than specifics. In this case, for example, the question is what factors affect consumer choice between disposables and durables? Now, as you can see, disposables and durables are quite relative terms that still need specification. And only once we go ahead and collect further knowledge, things will become clear to us. Knowledge can be collected from both the data as well as the literature, as said, hand in hand, so that gradually we will manage to specify the question further. In this case, at a second stage, it's what personal values, which is already much more specific, affect consumer purchase. So that's a choice between products of diverse lifespans. An example, single use through permanent use. So the question becomes more and more specific as the research progresses. And as said, the research question is the last thing that we will be writing up. And this is a good example for a final research question, how it might be looking like. At the very end of the research, we will manage to specify the question, how do expressed attitudes on environmental responsibility correspond to actual behavior regarding the purchase of single-use through permanent use products? So likely none of those things you could have been answering or asking at the very beginning of the research, because the question here has been written in a way that it matches to what the data and the literature can be answering. So this is a gradual process going on through the entire research. Now, the point here is, and this is interestingly something that quite often can be seen in research, the sort of understood that not any longer a problem, so let's take it out of the thesis. Now, if we use such an approach, then it will be very hard to fill any thesis, because as we go along, as the data becomes available, as the literature is being brought in, most of the questions can be answered. Now, if we take out everything that's answered and clear to us, that's a bit of a Sisyphus work, because we never ever would create the right body and substance for our research thesis. So answered, not any longer a problem and clear, yes, that's right, but please keep it in the thesis. Just decide, is it within the boundary or is it not? If it's within the boundary and the core of our research, it likely needs to be some more discussion within the analysis section. So the question should be leveraged into there. If it's an initial question that can be answered based upon the literature review, so that's fine, then the question might be closed already within the literature review. So it's on you as a researcher to decide which part is within the core and which is not. And everything that's within the core certainly would need a mentioning and place within the analysis section of the thesis, while every question that can be answered already based upon the literature review should be closed already within the literature review part. Now, understanding that the thesis is presented in a linear way, but that research is not taking place linear, and that knowledge is only becoming available as the research progresses, it is important for you to keep a track on the type of questions that can be answered based upon what. Even though then perhaps questions might be asked and closed within the literature review, that does not mean that they were at a very early point in time clear to you. That might also, it might only be the case at the very end of the research undertaking, but that based upon your evaluation of the situation, it is not the core of the research, and therefore you leave it within the literature part on where to answer this question and do not take it any further into the analysis. This is an informed decision that we need to take at one point in time, and perhaps we want to keep a track on which decisions we have been taking, for which questions to be answered where. Because if we keep track, which can be in the simplest form within a Word or Excel file, about those decisions, it will help us to draft our thesis in a very structured way. Is this clear about the difference on where questions are raised and answered within the thesis and the reason for that difference?
It is clear for me, yes.
All right. So then, one of the further things, and it's a thing that unfortunately can be observed frequently, that both the questions and the questioning can be faulty. And even well-published research is not free of that. One could argue that research always will consist of questions and questioning that is faulty, as it's sort of in the nature of research to tap into untapped waters. So there are some things that always will go wrong or be wrong, but there are some things that are obvious and that we need to try to spot and be aware of. For example, that the correlation does not imply causation, that we only see some data that support an argument, or that the data is overfitting, or that just the number of data is too small that something not really can be explained based upon such small samples. I think this is very important, and one simple example that I found here is if the Washington football team wins their last home game of the season, the incumbent party stays in the White House. Now, even though that had been perhaps true 17 out of the 9 last presidential elections, that still is not showing causality. So it's very simple, it's very obvious in this example. However, there might be much more data out in the research where it is not that obvious. To make it even more challenging, we are supposed to look for well-published authors. We are supposed to trust in journals that are well-rated. There is a supposed peer effect that will help to get faulty work detected. However, this not always will be the case. And if it's just for the reason what today is seen to be true, tomorrow is not, because research progresses. So it's, as a research novice, a bit of a tricky thing to question those that actually already went through the process and that are much further down the lane. However, we need to do that to some degree, and we need to try to train this. And this is the next thing. Training it will also require to train it in conjunction with a number of other things. One of the examples that can come in here is a problem view versus a solution view. Now, most of the tips and tricks that are written up by those that already know how to do research. So they will read and frame things in a way that makes sense to them, that is, however, perhaps misleading to the research novice. If we look at the example on the right side, then what most of the novices would get out of that tips is, what must I do to increase my sales to $1 million annually? However, what the writer likely meant once writing it was the decision problem as such. So the focus here is on what is the decision problem, and research should look into that, while the research novice likely would get out what the research novice is used to get out, using a solution view, looking at what must I do to just increase my sales to $1 million annually. So it's therefore tricky from a number of points to really understand what is just faulty questioning, or where is it just me not understanding the guides and reading them with a wrong lens. So this needs to be taken into account next to the thing of questions being perhaps faulty. Good. With this, we move into the second part of the webinar to look at the process of crafting research questions, and that it's actually a very structured way. And if you read guides in the right way and understand that questions do change over time and do evolve, and that the initial questions are very different than the final questions, then you find guides that really take you by hand and step by step explaining to you which type of questions to ask at which point in the research. And this can provide you with very valuable examples on how to frame your question. Now, some of the most obvious things once it comes to a thesis research is why am I doing this? So what is the interest in doing the research? The next thing is it urgent? It should be slightly urgent, but not too urgent, because if it's too urgent, the quest is towards solving the urgent matter rather than understanding and researching it. Now, and it should be researchable. And as said, it's not that questions pop out of the blue. They are drawn up based on earlier studies and what is not clear in earlier studies, what perhaps has been found and what has not found, what is contradicting in the literature, and so forth. So it's something that is done based upon existing literature and on existing research. Likewise, there are some general criteria for research questions, like they should be focused, specific, complex, but not be complicated. They must be clearly analytical and as much as possible unbiased. This is to say, open-ended without suggesting already a solution and not trying to interpret something into it. While all of these is obvious in practice, it might be a bit complex. Now, if I'm rushing too quickly through the slides, please do let me know. I will pause here for a while. Are there any questions thus far? Okay.
So a quick question, just to restate that point you made. I guess the balance that you're trying to strike there is not trying to lead the reader to some sort of conclusion in the question, and yet you're positing something in the question as well, probably based on what you've uncovered in the literature review. So it's that you're sort of teasing that there's an answer out there without giving the answer in the body of the question.
Do you mean at the initial stage or at the final stage?
At the final stage.
Yes. This obviously is also something to be taken into account. Perhaps it's not obvious, but now that you mention it, that you should not, even though you perhaps hold a strong knowledge, place it in such a way in the research question that the question already reads biased. So this is something in the nature of research that we always need to be critical and careful. And this is something that also needs to be expressed in the way we write and in the way we present our research. So yes, it should be unbiased, even though we might have very strong evidence collected that for something likely being the case, in the way we craft the question, that should not be put in that form. This should be left to where the data is presented and where the analytics is taking place. But the question should be framed in a very careful and critical way. Is this matching to your observation, or Jim?
Yeah, yes, I hadn't really thought of it in that way, but yeah, that's matching my experience, and I think you're clarifying it a bit more for me. So thank you for that.
All right. Now, let's look at the first bullet point here. There are three things mentioned: the problem statement, the research question, and the outcome expectation. Now, any one of them isolated might be quite simple to do. Likely the most complicated for someone who's coming from the business world is to put together a proper problem statement. Now, having the three in conjunction is a very tricky thing, because the mindset usually, and in particular at the beginning of the research, is shaped by the outcome expectation. Now, what do I need to do to make €1 million next year? Right, if I want to make €1 million next year, which is my outcome expectation, then such a research question is easily crafted. However, the question is neglecting entirely the existence of any problem. I mean, what is the problem of me not making 1 million next year? So this should be perhaps a question in the first case. Therefore, it is important for us to be aware of this tricky relationship between the problem statement, the research question, and the outcome expectations that we do hold. Only by knowing our outcome expectation and admitting it, we will be able to isolate it in such a way that it's not corrupting our research question, and by trying to shift the focus towards the problem in the first place. Is that a triple relation in between problem statement, research question, and outcome expectation clear?
Thank you.
Very well. And this is a tricky thing. So even if we are aware about that and try to be very careful and to derive our research question from the problem, the point here is we only understand the research problem at the very end. So what we understand very good at the beginning, however, is our outcome expectation. So this corruption process is a quite obvious one, and it is something that should be taken into account as the research progresses. And if we take that into account, we might be able to mitigate it in a way that it's not corrupting our research too much. Now, what 3 words best describe France? I found that rather funny. Cheese, wine, and rubbish. Good. Well, having said that, this answer can absolutely make sense to this type of question. So, question framing is something that, as just said, is something that is going along as we do the research and as the results become available, as the data is saturating, as more and more we will be able to craft the research question. This also means that the research question is something that links into our coding and analysis process. So, as said, a problem understood is not a problem to be forgotten. It's all part of the thesis research. It should stay in our documents, whatever we use to make sense of our research. And it can help us in our coding, in our analytics, in making sense out of the data. So good questions and putting the questions in related to the data that we obtain can help us in progressing through our research. Now, there are lots of good tips on how to question, how to frame questions. And what I found good in this tip actually are the points 3, 4, and 5, which also is important for those that do research under engagement of the stakeholders to whom the problem relates to. I think it's very important to engage our audience, so to understand what is clear to the audience and what is not, and to help our audience and the stakeholders to shape the questions as we go along. Because, and in particular, once it comes to research that is related to organizations and persons, which likely for most of our research is the case, there is a sense-making process within the research. It's all contextual, it's very sensual, so therefore it's important to engage those to whom the research and the problem relates, and to involve them as well into the question framing as also into the problem understanding and analysis process. Okay, before we come into the final part of the webinar, are there still any questions on the techniques that could be applied? All right, good. Then let's look into 4 example questions and let's see and understand if they are good questions or not. Now, in this example, what is the evidence for claims made about listening behavior, listening processes, and listening barriers in the popular, technical, and academic literatures? Any comments? Is that a good question or a bad one? Okay, let's look into it. Now, what is, starting with that, it's not clear what the data is needed for, what is the purpose of collecting the data. So it might be a good RQ11 or RQ12 within the context of a more specific question. However, alone, this question is not telling us much. Let's look into another example. What should theories of listening look like? What sort of terms ought they contain? And what are the specific components of good listening theory? Any views on that? No.
It's also a bad one.
It's also a bad one. It is. Any question that is just asking for speculation is clearly a bad one. And what is good listening anyway? Those are very subjective words. Now, having said that, it might make up a very good initial question as a first shot. As we know, questions do evolve. So yeah, it might be a good initial question within a wider context. However, if you are aware about things like speculations not being the best thing to do in a question, likewise, using words like good and bad, what is good, what is bad? Yeah, anyway. So let's look into another question. What theories exist to explain listening, broadly speaking, and how well do they stand to empirical scrutiny? Any suggestions?
This is too big.
Okay, why?
Well, how do you begin to analyze and scrutinize theories?
Yes, exactly. Again, we have here a connection without knowing if there's a causality, if there's a connection in between the existing of theories and how well do they stand. So it's a connection that should not be made, and it provides a wrong guidance. Now, let's look into a fourth example. This is from an abstract of a published research project. So I found it quite interesting to see that this is representing research that was funded. It was funded within a United States research project. And the statement is, our proposed project seeks to overcome this barrier by addressing the following actionable research question: how can existing data and insights into the policy process be leveraged to inform decision-making on where and how to intervene to effectively shift multiple access of food systems towards enhancing the sustainability of diets? Now, anyone, any view on this research statement? Is it a good question? Which type of question is it? It comes from published research. It was funded. It was well funded. It's from a northern hemisphere research. Now, one should expect this is a good research statement and question. Now, as a matter of fact, it might be, but it might only be to one. And the one is that one who was funding the research. It pitches all of the necessary things that makes the donor of the research happy. There will have initially been a promise of what the research project will do, and that promise must be kept. However, from a research perspective, it's a very, very not example to follow. There are interrelations that are unclear, and there are answers in the questioning. So it's meant really to only be read by one person or one organizations, which is those that were funding the research. Now, this is also important to understand because much of the research that gets published in the journals was funded in the first instance. If it was funded in the first instance, abstracts will be already written to please the donor organizations. Once abstracts are written, it's very tempting for a researcher to reuse it, to extract papers from it. Once papers are extracted from it, they make their way into journals. Once they're in the journals, you will read it and you will think as a research novice, oh, this is a good way to follow. Guess what? It is not. Is that making sense?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah,
Yes, it
it
is.
is.
Right.
So with this, let me stop the recording to provide